My name is John Hatter. I'm the Executive Director of Great Basin Resource Watch. If you have questions, clarifying questions during it, I think that's okay. We'll just have to keep to our 45 minutes. Yeah.
Can you say your last name again?
John Hatter, Hadder. It's on one of the slides too, and you'll have access to these.
All right, thank you.
I've got cards also. Before I forget, in the back, in the way back table, I brought some of our newsletter. We do a printed newsletter once a year, so just feel free to grab one. There's also 2 petitions back there too, and I'll talk about those in a minute as well. Some action items. One I think is particularly important on public lands generally. So a little bit about us. That's our group. That's the board and staff. Great Basin. We're not real large. We have some independent contractors work with us. We consider ourselves an environmental justice organization. We work a lot with communities to protect their land, air, and water, and so forth. So we kind of cover the gamut. We've been around since 1994. So here we are out with various communities on the land. We do that a lot. I know that probably many of you get out on the land a lot too. That's where things are happening, right? So that's what we do also. We get on the land, we get out with the communities as well. And that's a very important part of our priorities. When a community says, hey, we've got something going on here, that brings our attention up. Because there's so much mining that's happening in the Great Basin. It's mind-dizzy, boggling. How we work, we have 4 main program areas, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can see there. We kind of complete this triangle. Again, we get a lot of our direction from communities, but we talk to the mining industry plenty. A lot of things we don't agree on, but we have those conversations. If you don't have conversations, we don't have conversations with them, then it's harder to advance reform. So we think it's good to talk to everybody. And of course, we also talk to regulators as well. So we kind of try to complete the process. That's how we operate. So we work in a lot of different ways. We do some technical work. We do advocate for mining reforms as well. We work in coalitions. I know that my friend Laura, who's here with Wild Horse Education, we have worked together on some mining projects that have significant effects on lands, which is what you guys are, I think, a lot about in part. Anyway, so coalition work is really important because that's the only way a lot of times we get progress on mining, because they have so much leverage in this state, enormous leverage. So have to work together. We are on, right here, we're on Washoe Paiute lands. We always acknowledge that these lands were taken care of for at least a millennium or more by indigenous peoples, and they are some of the most dramatically affected by mining and are often the most important critics of what we do on land. So we always want to recognize that we are on their lands. Extent of mining, this is a fairly old map, but it still kind of gives you the idea of where things are happening. A lot of it, you can see there's not as much in southern Nevada as there is in northern, but there's a lot happening in general. But what's happened also is that we're looking at an increase in mining across the West particularly, but everywhere, to get transition minerals for EVs, for solar technologies and all that. Our organization is not opposed to these technologies, but they come with a price. They're not, when they say it's clean, well, clean, but you got to do extraction in some cases. So we're seeing a lot of pressure on environments and communities on these new, and the way that they're being rolled out is a way that is very difficult, more difficult for the public to engage and actually have accountability on these projects. It's very difficult. The Thacker Pass project, which many of you may have heard about, which has got a lot of attention, I'll talk a little bit about later, is a good example of the problems with these kinds of minerals in terms of accountability. It's a big challenge. Here in Nevada, 30,000 mining claims filed just on lithium alone in the past 5 to 8 years. It is crazy. People are filing claims everywhere and wanting to do exploration, and with exploration comes damage, and they may not go anywhere with the mines.
here in northern Nevada, I live here too, there's a lot going on with the lithium miner people
Right.
trying to take over the Native American lands.
Right.
Are you working with the Native
Oh, yes.
American people?
We work with indigenous communities all the time because they're often the hardest hit.
Yeah.
One thing that happens is, of course, with indigenous communities is if there's a cultural value to the land, and even non-indigenous people have cultural values of the land, but theirs go way back. It's irreversible. Once that land has been changed by mining, that cultural site is gone forever.
And the lands are sacred to them.
Correct. Yes.
With the exploration and stuff like that, is there requirements that they repair the land when they leave, or can
Yes, there is reclamation, but what does that mean? We'll talk about that. Yeah, what does that mean? So anyway, this is ramping up in a big way. And Nevada is somewhat at the forefront. You probably heard some of the language about the lithium loop and all this stuff they want to do with lithium economy. If we can actually have a real circular economy, great. But that's a big question mark in our mind. Some specific concerns: environmental, earth disturbances, open pits. Often it's permanent. They never reclaim the open pits. They get a waiver from the state basically to do that. I mean, it's in the regulations to reclaim it, but they ask for, oh, can we not reclaim the open pit? And they say, yeah, every time. Habitat destruction is complete. I'll talk about that a little bit more too. Groundwater pumping is significant. I'll talk about water is a big part of how lands and wildlife in particular are affected people on the lands. Surface and groundwater contamination can often occur. Often it's indefinite. Water quality, air quality is, while the mining operation is in place, there's often waste left behind. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, what I mean by that. There's the hazardous waste that they use for processing. They get rid of that. But there's other waste left over from processing which actually remains on public land. I'll talk about that. And there's also water allocation as well. Where do they get the water from? Who are they taking it from? Is they taking it from environmental needs, public needs, personal needs? Toxic tailings, that's one of the waste products, is the tailings. Tailings is the end product. That's why it's called tailings. It's a tail end. After they've extracted the ore, the tailings are left over. And they often hold a lot of toxic metals, and they're basically left on public land. They're supposed to reclaim them, but they're sitting there. Reclamation often is poor ecological succession. Some reclamation is better than others, of course, but it's hard to restore something to a pre-mining state, and that's really not required by law. What's required is a post-mining productive use, which is defined in Nevada statutes. And of course, there's cultural concerns, we talked about a little bit just now, especially when you've got sacred sites that are never going to be replaced. It's permanent. So our position at Great Basin Resource Watch is that mining should be minimized. Can it go away completely? No. Look at all the things we depend on for mining. Maybe our economy can eventually reach a point where we're reusing more materials, recycling more materials, so we can reduce the amount of mining. But we don't advocate for that, certainly not in the short term, because that could cause catastrophic problems as well. But we do strongly advocate for how can we keep reusing materials, making them better, manufacturing them with recycling and reuse in mind so that we can minimize this. There's no doubt from our work that large-scale mining is very destructive to natural ecosystems and disruptive to the host communities as well. Often communities become divided, and it creates a lot of tension within the communities, particularly in communities which have low resources. They don't have a lot of finances, so the mining companies provide financial carrots to say, to support their project, and so you get the yeses and the nos, and it creates a lot of tension. So, for example, just give you a couple snippets. Two pieces of information that come from the United Nations International Resource Panel. 90% of biodiversity loss is from extraction and processing. 90%. We are a very extractive culture, and we do not put back. I think it's a lesson we can learn from a lot of indigenous communities that have a sort of a reciprocity. So that's a big one. The other one is that climate impacts, 20% from 1970 to 2017 from just minerals and metals alone. So this is another thing that a lot of people, we deal with a lot, is that people say, well, we need the lithium, we need all this for climate. Yes, but mining has a climate footprint, and it's pretty big. So that's why we think got to minimize it. And plus, from the U.S. Forest Service, 10,000 miles of rivers and streams have been contaminated by acid mine drainage, estimated, mostly in the western United States. So that's why we say it's very destructive, and we need to be more careful. That's the bottom line. Especially if we need to extract more for the new technologies, we've got to be more careful. So one take-home lesson is we do not relax our standards, we make them better. And we make them better in the United States, they'll be better in other countries as well. Because other countries look to what we do. So if we relax our standard, it's going to be worse elsewhere as well.
Is there going to be availability to your slides?
Yes, this is all public. You bet, no problem. They have it and they can do whatever they want with it.
I can't write that down.
Yep. So before I forget, a couple actions items, and I'll have this at the end as well, just a reminder. One is in Nevada, we're trying to deal with the problem that water at mine sites, water systems are not reclaimed. Reclamation is about land, not water. So there's legacies left over. One of the legacies is mining pit lakes, which I'll show you some pictures of those. From our point of view, that is water that's wasted. It's not accessible to the public. It's often not accessible to critters. Sometimes it's toxic. And it also affects the surrounding area. But also the water systems are changed in a dramatic way. So that's one piece. That's one of the petitions we have in the back. We had a bill last session on this. It didn't make it through. That's fine. We'll run it again. We can find a sponsor. Yes?
Can any of that wasted water be put into gray water systems or not? Because of the toxicity?
No, I mean, it could be, but it's basically the way it works on the site on those pit lakes is that they're supposed to keep people away from them. Access. There's no access. That's a problem. Outside of Nevada, in Congress, there's something called the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act. This is a really dangerous bill that our senator from Nevada, Cortez Mastos, has spearheaded. He's got all the other senators, all the other delegation behind it. This is horrible. And this just a few talking points. That's the other petition back there is for the counter bill to this to say, here's what we should be doing. So let's put out the positive. Yeah.
Bill number?
It's changed. But you look up Regulatory Clarity Act. That's the best thing because it's kind of in flux. What it would do is right now, if you file a mining claim on public lands, you have a right under U.S. law to work the claim. Okay, that means you can go out there and explore and do stuff. But you don't have the right to occupy it permanently. You can't permanently displace all other uses. Under this act, any claim, you would have a right not only to work the claim, but displace all other uses. Permanent occupation of the land. Permanent occupation. And on top of that, if you go to file a mining claim, if you look at the form, there is nothing on the claim about how much mineral is there. You don't even have to show that there's a mineral there to do a claim. You can just make the claim. And so this displaces potentially all other kinds of uses of public lands. Very dangerous. It gives the industry even more leverage to move things around. And it creates a lot of speculation. So we definitely want to oppose that. Let our delegation know the petition in the back is for a bill, which is what we should be doing on a national level. So those are two actions. So a little bit of background. Mining, I basically call it 5 stages. The first is the exploration. I'll show some pictures of that. Some of you have seen that. The initial exploration is just air reconnaissance, but eventually they have to drill to find out how much mineral's there. And people have asked me, well, isn't there any way around it? No. At some point, if they think that there's a rich enough deposit, in order to know whether there's valuable minerals, whether they can develop mine, they eventually have to drill. Unfortunately. Permitting process is going through the bits, the state of Nevada, the federal government, all that sort of all the different permitting areas. So and by the time they get to a permitting process, usually the mining company already has its plan of operations. It's really hard to change things at that point because they've dedicated enormous resources to developing at that point, and so they dig their heels in. They have very difficult to get changes at that point. Has happened, can happen, but it's difficult. It's better to get in earlier and talk about the plan. So that, of course, the federal government will not say that. They'll say, "Oh no, the plan's still changeable." Not in practice. And then they get through the permitting process. There's construction, and I'll show you some pictures of that. And once the construction starts, the habitat's pretty much gone. It's there. Operations, blasting, drilling, all that kind of stuff, processing, and then closure and reclamation. And the reclamation is to try to restore things to a post-mining use. Which could be to support solar panels, to be honest. That's a potential post-mining use as well. Just FYI, that's come out recently. So here's what exploration looks like a little bit. The resolution on this is not phenomenal, but you can, I don't know if this little laser thing works. I can't really see. But you can kind of see the lines, the roads and everything. So they're already fragmentating the habitat. It's already getting damaged. Any species that's sensitive to sound, dust, and so forth, that's another issue. So what I'm just showing you is that it increased from 2006 to 2016. So that's what exploration does. It creates all that kind of area. And this is in the West Pequops. Construction, you can see what happens. This is the Mount Hope. This is Mount Hope. Now, this project is currently dead, thanks to our litigation, along with people that worked with us on this one. But before we were able to stop the permitting, they already started building the mine. And you see what they left. A huge scar, still there. So whatever habitat was there is gone. It's important to note that they removed topsoil and put it aside for reclamation, but they release a whole bunch of carbon. Whenever you scrape the soil like that, whether it's mining or whether you're building houses or whatever, even in the desert, there's a lot of carbon stored in the ground. And so this project should never even gotten that far along. So that's just an example. Extraction, we've seen these as open pits, processing facilities. There's a lot of dirt moving. There's a lot of particulate created during that. Blasting can be very loud. Light pollution, it's like lit all the time. These things run 24/7. They never shut down in most cases. Oh, thank you. I've got my water here too. That's good. This pit mine, I see there's a typo. It shouldn't be an E there. It's not pimple, whatever. I noticed that just now. Been using this one. Anyway, this was the mine that started our organization because of how much water they were pumping initially, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Then processing, and they've got all kinds of processing facilities. This is down at Mountain Pass where they extracted what they call rare earth elements, which are used in magnets, they're used in semiconductors, they're of great interest to the military, all that kind of thing. This is an enormously toxic area. Well, they're trying to but there have been problems with that one. So you get these various processing ponds. There's a tailings impoundment. That's Gold Quarry in 2010. It's bigger than that now. So the material behind that tailings is generally pretty toxic. I mean, it's leftovers. So they're supposed to regrade that and plant vegetation on it eventually. What's happened in some places in the world is these tailings facilities have failed, and they're often built in drainages because you've got two sides already, and so all you need is one dam wall. And when they do that, they contaminate river systems. There was one in South America that collapsed about 5 years ago, killed about 20 people when it did because it went suddenly. The whole thing just liquefied. So this tailings is a big issue for a lot of. In Nevada, we're dry, so we don't usually get that kind of failure, but they remain on. That's one of the toxic legacies of mine sites, and that's certainly allowed. A heap leach pad is another one. This is a cyanide leach pad, also at Pipeline, spelled correctly this time. And they're taking gold. And what you can see around here is there's a little black edge. So underneath that pad is a thick plastic liner because they're spraying sodium cyanide solution on top. The cyanide is grabbing the gold chemically, and they're collecting the solution at the bottom, and then they take the gold off the cyanide and they run it again. So
Cyanide stays?
it sprays. It sprays. And so whenever you see facilities that are real squared off, kind of geometric like that, they're often, and they have that black line around them. A lot of that in Nevada for particulate gold, for small. Cyanide is obviously very toxic. It's not persistent in the environment. It doesn't last very long. It breaks down relatively quickly, so it hasn't been a really big concern here in Nevada as much. It's been difficult to sort of try to outlaw it. Like in Montana, for example, it's illegal to use heap leach. But they have a lot of surface water issues. And if cyanide gets into the surface water, moves quickly, it can be a big problem. Yeah?
Quick question. You said that is contained in a thick plastic,
It's on the bottom.
and who inspects that plastic? Because plastic breaks down.
Yes, it does. They're supposed to have systems underneath to detect a leak detection system and so forth. It's not foolproof, but eventually that plastic will deteriorate over time. And if it doesn't get reclaimed well, if you don't get a good vegetative community growing on top of it, it could eventually be a source of pollution into the groundwater system. These liners are considered to be containment in the state of Nevada, but they don't last forever. They can fail. And depending upon what's holding, what kind of liquids are in contact with it. I'll talk about acid mine drainage in a little bit, but that can be a problem as well with these liners. So, and then reclamation. So here's a waste rock dump that they've already recontoured it in 2015, and they're getting ready to seed it. This is the Rochester's mine, which is not far from Lovelock in Nevada. Some reclamation looks pretty good. It just depends on the nature of the material. If the waste rock is fairly what they call chemically benign and so forth, it's easier to get stuff to grow on it and so forth. In some cases, it's really difficult. The sites down in Earrington at the Anaconda mine down there, they did acid leaching there. There's a lot of residual acid in the material. Almost impossible to get anything to grow on them. So that can happen. But as I mentioned before, no requirement to restore water systems to a pre-mining state. No requirement. So a little bit about water, because water's a big one. A lot of people don't think about it as much. Mines use water in two ways. They have what's called a consumptive use, which is defined by the state of Nevada. So that's water that's gone. It's gone. It's out of the basin completely. And they use it for dust control. It's amazing. It's amazing how much they actually do use for dust control. A huge amount, because there's a lot of particulate. And then the rest of it goes for processing. They crush the ore up, make the cyanide solution, you name it, whatever the processing materials are. Water goes for that. And so that's a consumptive use. But also at mine sites, a lot of times the ore is actually located within the water table, or below the water table, as they say. And if you try to excavate a mine that's below the water table, it's going to get really wet. It's like when you go to the beach and you dig in the sand, the water starts coming in. That's exactly what will happen at a mine site. That's a problem. So what they do is they put in these pumping around where the ore is, and they artificially lower the water table where the mine is. It's called dewatering. And the lowering of the water table is called a cone of depression. In some cases, they lower the water table 1,000 feet or more. That's as deep as Tahoe. It's getting pretty deep. They're not as big as Tahoe, but they're deep in some cases. So that means a lot of pumping. You got to get a lot of water out of the way to do that. That's called dewatering. That's a non-consumptive use. As long as the water stays in the same basin, the state engineer says, well, it's in the same basin, it's not lost, so it's still kind of there. But the deep aquifer is affected in a dramatic way, which will take often over 100 years to recover.
I was going to say, what do they do with the water that they take out?
Yes, what do they do with the water? Because if they don't need all that water, which they don't,
Right.
what they try to do mostly is they create what they call infiltration basins, which are almost like a big square area, and then they create like a sort of like a marshy. They put water in it so it's sort of marshy, and so it soaks back into the ground. But that's not the deep aquifer. So you're taking water, ancient water from the deep, and you're putting it on the surface. So it's not the same. The water system's not the same as it was before. And there is some evaporation loss there too. But it creates an enormous groundwater deficit. How much water is pumped? Well, now I'm sorry this figure's pretty old, but it's hard to get recent numbers from the state engineer's office. They don't publish them that much, but this gives you a sense. Total volume pumped in 2015, for example, was almost 190,000 acre feet, which rivals how much we use in the Truckee River annually. That's how much they pumped. And this is, if you're not used to acre feet, here's the conversion, that many gallons. We're talking about billions of gallons of water. The thing that's important to note here is that 64,000 of that was returned to the basin, and they used 101,000 consumptively. So that's gone. That's water that's gone. They actually buy a lot of ranches, too. In Crescent Valley, where I showed you the pipeline mine, those pictures, that used to be all private ranches in there. The mining company owns pretty much all of those ranches now. One way to avoid conflicts with other water users is to buy them out. And so that's one of the things that they do, is they will buy out. And so they run the ranches, they keep them going. It's one way to deal with the extra water also. But they don't really care about ranching, obviously. How much water is in Pit Lake? So here's a picture of a pit lake. This is the Lone Tree Pit Lake. It's if you see this line, I don't think this thing really is. You can't see it. You can see the line that kind of on the upper corner there. That's Interstate 80, and the Humboldt River is only a little bit further. So this is pretty close to the Humboldt River, within a mile. Collectively in Nevada, we estimated that all of the pit lakes that we are eventually going to have would amount to about 550 billions of gallons of water that we can't access. It's a huge amount of water. The Lone Tree Pit Lake is this one's probably about 45,000 acre feet right now. It's pretty good size. And you notice it's got a kind of an odd color. It's one of the pit lakes that went really sour, and I mean sour, like acid sour. And it happened fast, and it wasn't predicted at all. In fact, they said, it's going to be just fine. Couple things, so there's no post-mining use, there's no beneficial use for this water, and even if it doesn't go real sour, in general, mining pit lakes have lower water quality than the surrounding aquifer. So you're taking water of a certain quality and you're degrading it. Not by law you're degrading it. Nevada law allows this to happen. I can get into the details of it if people want to ask, but basically it's to distinguish between surface and groundwater. But we all know that most of that water is coming from the ground. And typically what happens is there's a lower quality when it's a pit lake. It could just be saltier, but it's definitely lower quality. So we're taking a lot of water and we're making it into lower quality water too. So pit lakes we think is an issue that people seem to recognize. We got some traction in the legislature. We're going to keep pushing on this one. As I mentioned, this one did go really sour at the very beginning in 2009. Only 2 years after it started filling. Look at the color. That automatically kind of tells you that's not water you want to be involved with. So in 2008, they added 1,900 tons of caustic soda. That's what they use to clean drain cleaner is lye. It's caustic soda. That is the equivalent. Is the equivalent amount to neutralize 2 million average car batteries of acid. There was a lot of acid being generated, and it's still being generated to this day. In fact, an analysis that was done back in 2017, 2016 determined that 19 and 20 tons of acid enter the pit lake every day. So what is 19 to 20,000 tons? You know those tanker trucks that go to the gas stations? One of those every other day dumping acid into the lake is basically what it amounts to. Unbelievable amount of acid generation that they didn't predict. There wasn't any EISs or anything. It's like, how could you be so wrong? So we got to be careful. They're also dangerous because in other ways. Yes.
Could you run that slide once more about the EIS? It said.
Yeah, the final EIS in 1996 So it's actually going to be not even acid, but actually slightly basic, the opposite. Yeah.
Because that was my question.
Yeah.
Is how successfully do you challenge these in EAs and EIS, and also
It's difficult.
are you going to touch on Arizona a little bit because there's a huge lithium boom.
Oh yeah, it's all over the West. Yeah, I mean, in terms of when it comes to technical issues and challenging legally, it's very difficult. The courts automatically kind of defer to the agency, and this is the Chevron case. It's related to Chevron. That may change a little bit, but it's very difficult to get any traction. Usually, what we have to do is we have to have 3 Nobel Prize PhDs to say, yes, these guys are right and they're wrong. That's what it takes a lot of times. It's really difficult to win technical arguments. So it's good to get in on it early as possible. This is a really interesting case. We can talk more about it if we have time. We probably don't, but we have done quite a bit of analysis on this one, and it's just they update their models and they're still wrong. So we have to admit that we can't predict water quality in some of these things that well, and we have to have appropriate policies that address that uncertainty that exists, because it's there. Some pit lakes, no problem, but some of them, when they go sour, it's really hard to predict them. But also there's the issue of entry. I mean, this is what happens to mining pit lakes is they collapse. You don't even have to have a pit lake there, but a pit lake kind of moves the collapsing a little bit faster along, because as the water rises, it softens the walls. So this is dangerous. It's dangerous to people and critters. And basically what they do is they make a berm and they put up a fence, and that's supposed to last for indefinitely. So there you go.
Migrating birds often land on them?
Yes, that happens. They have to deal with that issue. That's significant. In the case of this pit lake, it was very toxic, and that's one reason why they have to neutralize it, is to keep it so that it's not a hazard to migrating birds. In some cases where there's toxic ponds, they have little balls they put on there to keep them off of it. But that is an issue, birds. Pit lakes will continue to draw water indefinitely because of that evaporation, so they affect springs in the area. They can affect springs regionally. It's hard to know exactly how much. It just depends on how big the mining pit lake is. But they act like a big well, constantly pumping water because of the high evaporation in Nevada, particularly, because we have a high evaporation rate. So collectively, we expect that evaporation will lose about that much annually, 10,000 to 11,000 acre feet per year just gone. In some cases, that's a significant amount of water that's available in the basin. So the evaporation is not negligible. So they have a permanent. This is a permanent change to the water system. Doesn't recover unless you backfill it. Unless you backfill the pit. Some of the consequences of the pumping I talked about. Here you can see the gray areas of the mine boundaries. The drawdown, 10-foot drawdown of the water table is the green and red lines, depending upon which. So you see it spreads out. And if you go down to 1 foot drawdown, it goes out further. So it can have a significant effect regionally.
So
Just
how
the
much water is left after they do that?
Well, that's a good question. It all depends on how much pumping. For the Lone Tree pit, I just showed you, that pit there was in the basin, close to the Humboldt River. They had to pump on the order at one point of up to 80,000 to 100,000 acre feet a year. That's enormous. That's like half the use of the Truckee Meadow in 1 year.
So if burros are digging for water, we'll never get it.
In some cases, that's true. Some springs can go dry, and it's just long term. And this will probably take over 100 years to recover. And remember, it will be the same probably. So it's almost like there's an enormous underground deficit of water. You may have some stuff on the surface, but underground deep.
Has the ground sunk?
In some cases, yes. In Lone Tree, it did. In fact, the highway at Route 80, actually, they had to fix it 3 or 4 times because of the subsidence in Pumpernickel Valley where that Lone Tree pit was. And there used to be a sign up about it, and I think it's finally not. But yeah, that can happen, subsidence.
So they're never required to analyze these impacts, even like the future one you talked about, the highway fixing?
Well, they're supposed to analyze them, but they have to be able to predict what's going to happen. If you don't do the analysis well enough, you're not going to know what the consequences could be. And so sometimes things just Oh, well, we didn't know it was going to do that. Well, you didn't, you just didn't do the analysis well enough. You didn't really get in there and dig,
They wanna know.
Most of the technical analysis comes from consultants paid for by the mining companies. So independent assessment is critical and often doesn't occur.
Conflict of interest?
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? So these are some of the consequences with water. Permanent loss affects all kinds of aspects of the lands, including your wild horses. They need water to drink as well, like everything else. So water's a big deal, and how much it can affect areas regionally and how long it takes to recover. The government, the industry and government approach is basically, we call it inadequate and disrespectful. It's inadequate because it doesn't protect sources. Once they wait until the spring starts to die. Now there's a problem. Let's go after it. But they don't. The source is what keeps the riparian area the way it is. If you don't have the source there, they're bringing a pipe over. That's the mitigation. It's not a very good mitigation to sort of preserve the riparian area. And for a lot of indigenous folks, there's cultural significance to the springs, which are source-driven as well. So that's why I say it's disrespectful. Again, indigenous knowledge is put aside. Acid mine drainage is another big water quality problem, and it happens here in Nevada, even though we're a dry state. That's what's amazing. Oh, we don't have water pollution problem. Yes, we do. Unfortunately, we do. This is the Rio Tinto mine that's up near Owyhee area in northeastern Nevada. So basically, the upper picture, that's me, about 2007, pointing to the acid mine drainage, and there's Cassandra, our staff member, recently pointing to the same acid mine drainage. And this thing can go on for hundreds of years, even 1,000 years, until the ore is finally used up, the reactive ore. So this is a problem at a lot of mine sites, and it can go on for a really long time. The Phoenix mine site, which is currently in operation, it exists outside of Battle Mountain, and they're expecting to treat acid drainage forever. Forever. Basically, I was told one of our staff members, Houston, is a geochemist. He used to work as a consultant. And he said, yeah, we worked on that one. We ran the model 20,000 years, and it was still producing problems. Now, that's a model, okay? But it gives you the scope. So their plan is basically treating 600 gallons per minute of toxic acid mine drainage for basically forever. This is allowed. So long as the mining company can present evidence that they can capture the toxins and treat it and it won't get into the environment, it's allowed. But who's going to be around in 200 years? How are they going to? So there's a lot of questions about this whole perpetuity issue. Like, how does that work?
If the company responsible for the remediation goes under, or is that a situation where it becomes a Superfund site?
It can.
Falls off on the government instead.
You can. Now, in the case of Phoenix, the surety is currently a little bit. It's over $569 million at this point. And is that going to be enough? Well, hopefully. Nevada's bonding regulations are pretty good. You just have to make sure you do the analysis to know what you're going to need. If you don't do the analysis well enough, then your bonding's not going to be there. This also will require some kind of mechanism to provide money for treatment 100, 200 years, 300 years down the road. If the financial institutions are still around to do that.
I might have missed this. Who's the quote from? The holder of the permit?
Oh, this is the NAC, Nevada Administrative Code. That's the Nevada Administrative Code. So the Nevada.
It's contradicted from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah. Ensure that all mined areas do not release contaminants. I mean, that's the idea. Capture. If they can demonstrate to the agency that it's not going to leak out somewhere. I know, it's.
What's the site mining for?
I'm sorry?
What is the site mining?
Copper, gold, and silver. Yeah. And the waste rock material is very acid generating. I mean, if you put it in water and it starts to generate acid, it's like 85, really high. And they knew that going into it, unless they still permitted it. This is Mary Gibson. She's Western Shoshone, and again, that's a relationship, how important water is to our planet, to our people, to our way of life. Other areas that are affected, Bound Hope Project. Currently, this is the one that we've got stopped for now, but as you can see, there's a wilderness area near it. You've got springs all around it. Huge impact. This would have been an enormous mine. You saw the scrape. That was where the pit was going to be, and then there'd be these big waste piles all around.
So how do you stop it? For now?
We stopped it because of the spring issue. There are something called federal water reserves, federal publicly protected water. And it's sort of a complicated explanation. We can talk about it, but basically that's how we stopped it. We said you can't cover those springs because they're protected waters, and you can't prove that you've got valuable minerals in those springs, so the mining law doesn't apply. You can't permanently occupy it. Here's another area, Long Canyon. This was one that I believe Laura's group, Wild Horse Agency, was honest with this one. This project, unfortunately, did get started. As you can see, there's some really striking areas back in the Queeclops Range. It's right next to areas considered to have wilderness protections characteristics. They don't care. This mine did get started, unfortunately, but what we did do is our water protest action did stop them from going below the water table, because they would have pumped a lot of water and they would have affected the Johnson Springs complex, which is 88 springs. Huge resource for the area. So you can get some traction sometimes. Other things that are affected, here's the Bald Mountain site. You've got the Ruby Marshes above, Ruby Mountains, but you can see this mine site sprawls across the range, potentially blocking migration routes. So these mines can affect migratory paths as well. I want to say a little bit about Thacker, because I consider it dangerous because of the way that it got permitted. It moved so fast and ran over so many issues, particularly indigenous issues. And so I want to say a couple things about that. This is not how we should permit mines, but the industry is saying this worked. And they say that. I've heard them say it in several public areas about this was a good process. It was the worst process I've seen, almost the worst process I've ever seen, because it moved so fast. And it would happen during 2020, during COVID. And did they stop the process to let people deliberate in person in the native communities and in the non-native? No. Move ahead. Of course, it was a Trump mandate to do it, but they could have stopped it. If the mining company had said, we want to pause the permit, yeah, they would have stopped it, because another mine did exactly that for other reasons. The analysis, so they didn't explore all the problems, so there's probably going to be stuff happens down the road, like, oh, well, we didn't study that. Like, for example, they didn't study in the EIS the fact that there's a man camp that they're building in Winnemucca. They didn't study in the EIS that there's a molten sulfur transfer station. I mean, it's like the list is there. So what's important, we think is important, is it doesn't matter what the end use of the mineral is, the analysis needs to be just as rigorous. Yeah. So that's a key point I want to make sure that, and that's what happened with Thacker is that people said, oh, it's lithium, so we should look the other way. Well, there's consequences to that. So it triggered a lot of bad legislation, including the one I just talked about, with Senator Cortez Matos, and also affected the court system, because we actually had a win in the court, but the courts didn't provide there's no consequences to that. So, and of course, there's lots of wildlife aspects out there that are all affected as well at Thacker Pass. Sage grouse is an important one. I want to say one thing about sage grouse, and then we'll close it up, and that is that we have a system for dealing with sage grouse in the state, Kristen. It does not protect populations. It's a habitat thing. So if you've got a mine site like this one that's going to knowingly affect or believed to affect populations, the credit system and so forth does no good. Those populations will die anyway, and there's no effort to replace them. And this is a quote from Endow. Neither the system can account for the expiration of leaks or population impacts. Doesn't work. Whoops, sorry. Anyway, so I want to. I'll go. There's a whole bunch of stuff here I put on stack. Extra slides I didn't think we'd do anyway. Here's our recommendations. Advocate for what's called community right to know. Critical that we decouple environmental and community consequences from the analysis. It's got to be just as rigorous either way. Community right to know says public has a right to know how they're going to be affected. It's a basic concept. Mining companies can't argue with it. Regulators can't argue. Oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. Now it's a matter of putting it to use. And I'll put, if you want to know more, this will be on the slides as well. That take it to some of our information pages and so forth. So